So, to begin with, and by the way, you'll notice in your worksheets that in beneath among these different points, I have for you both the English translation, specifically it's called the NRSV, dozens and dozens of translations in English of the New Testament, but this is the one that we use in this course, NRSV. All modern translations are problematic, as we're going to see, followed by the Greek text. So if you look at the Greek text below the English translation, you now get the joke. It's Greek to me. Okay. So there's the first time and the last time you'll ever see this in your lives. I'm glad for that. Okay. Moreover, I said that, remember, this was never meant to be simply read in silence. It was meant to be proclaimed. So I'm going to read these very brief. It's only about 150 words in the English translation. So 8 verses, okay? Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which you also stand, through which you are also being saved, if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you, unless you've come to believe in vain. For I handed on to you, as of first importance, what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. Now, notwithstanding the fact that it's in a modern translation, we don't have the appreciation for how it actually sounds in Greek, especially its musicality, it's still very stilted, even in Greek. It doesn't sound that good. The reason is because, remember what I just said about Paul. He was a lawyer. And so all of his letters, his approach is not only having these letters intended to be read aloud to a live audience, but he's doing so in the sense of making a legal case, like he's arguing a case in court to prove his case, namely Jesus Christ. Okay, so that's the first thing to keep in mind, and that leads us to, on your worksheets, this number 2, or Roman numeral 2b, repetition. As a piece of literature, whether you're reading it or as you're listening to it, you might tend to get lost. At first glance, it doesn't seem to flow well. It doesn't sound good. A lot of phrases are very repetitive, like if you look at what is highlighted in yellow, both in the English translation as well as in the original Greek text below. If you look at those phrases highlighted in yellow, I would remind you, I proclaim to you, I proclaim to you, I handed on to you. Or in the green, in accordance with the Scriptures, in accordance with the Scriptures. There must be a reason why he's repeating this. And of course there is. First of all, notice how many times Paul, in just the first 2.5 verses, repeats this. I would remind you, I proclaim to you, I proclaim to you, I hand it on to you. Paul is using what, at the time, in the first century, would have immediately registered in the ears of anyone listening to this. This is a classical, ancient world, classical rhetorical advice used most especially by lawyers to establish authority. That is what Paul is doing here. I would remind you, I proclaim to you, I am Paul. I am the authority. You are not. Okay. So that's not something unique to Paul. That was actually standard if you're a lawyer in the ancient world. We'll just characterize it that way. Now, here comes to one of those radical innovations that I mentioned earlier, for which Paul is credited as having introduced and changed everything for ever after. Here it is. Verse 3, for I handed on you as of first importance what I, radical innovation, in turn had received. What I in turn had received. Paul's already established himself as the authority. You are not. What are you? You are the community, and you are not in a position of authority. The radical innovation, Paul says, what I in turn had received. In other words, Paul, the authority, is now identifying himself with the community. Paul's the authority, you're the community, you're not. But Paul is also, if you will, in the same boat together with you. Paul identifies himself as one of the community, with the community. Radical innovation at the time. Forget about Jesus Christ or Christianity, just that idea that an authority is also one of the community. Okay. The second strange repetition of things in accordance with the scriptures, If you're a lawyer, let's say you need two things to make your case. Two things. One of them is something called legal precedent. So, for example, let's say in the United States of America system, in a courtroom, the prosecution or the defense, whatever, says, Your Honor, if it please the court, I cite the case of, Jefferson versus the state of Virginia, let's just say, right? That is something that already has been decided upon, a previous legal matter, case, issue. That's called legal precedent. That is Paul's use of this phrase, in accordance with the scriptures. In accordance with the scriptures. What are the scriptures to which he's referring? The writings of the Old Testament, specifically Mosaic law. That is Paul's legal precedent for establishing what he is proposing to be the truths of Jesus Christ. Okay. So, legal precedent, his use of in accordance with the scriptures. But there's the last repetitive word or phrase that he uses here. Appeared. Appearances. This is most repetitive. In fact, he mentions that after Jesus was raised from the dead, he appeared no less than 6 times. 6 mentions of this. Appeared, appearances, etc. 6 times. To begin with this, the use of this device, what's the second thing a good prosecutor wants if they want to win, let's say, God forbid, a murder case? Right? Eyewitness testimony. eyewitness testimony. So that is Paul's use of the appearances. Okay. The last thing we want to mention before we get into, is there something more to those appearances? He mentions it 6 times. Indeed, there is. The last thing we want to mention right before that is 2 letters C. The Greek word kerygma. Kerygma. You'll notice highlighted in, I guess it's fuchsia, fucsia. We say in Italian, that kind of hot pink or whatever it is. In the English translation, good news. And if you look down below in the original Greek, the word is evangelion. Evangelion. This is where we get the word in English, evangelist, as in a gospel writer, or evangelical, gospel. What it really means is simply a message. Okay. And later on, shortly after, Paul will say, it's of first importance. I handed this on to you as of first importance, this evangelion, this gospel, this message. It's of first importance. If you needed to give someone a really short, one-line definition of what does it mean to be a Christian, this is it. Paul gives it to us here. And biblical scholars like to call this the first kerygma of Christianity, of the church. It's a Greek word meaning kind of like a kernel that contains all that flavorful goodness that explodes when you pop it. Okay, so kerygma. Mission statement, the creed. What does it mean to be a Christian? I don't want to sit through a course on this. Just give me a 1-sentence definition. Paul does it right here. And it is located in verses 3 through 5. Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. Point number 1, Christ died. And that he was buried. Point number 2, buried. That means in the ancient world that he was really dead. He hadn't just slipped into what today we would call a coma and suddenly was raised from the dead. No, he was really dead. And that he was raised on the 3rd day. That's point number 3. Finally, the 4th point, which even a lot of theologians usually tend to overlook, gloss over. It's the most important because Paul mentions it 6 times. The 4th point to this kerygma, and that he appeared. It's actually the most important point. So those 4 points make up the church's earliest, Christianity's earliest creed, mission statement, kerygma. Died, buried, raised, and appeared. Okay. With that, looking down now at number 3 on your worksheets, regarding these 6 instances of appearances. That's a lot, but it also appears that Paul is perhaps providing us with an outline of sorts. An outline for what? For what theologians refer to in Christian theology as ecclesiology. Logos, logical, rational principle of something, of what? First have the word ecclesia. Ecclesia. Hence the term ecclesiology. Okay, well, so what does ecclesia mean? Western democracy was first invented in where? Same places. French fries, Greece. Okay. In the 8th century BCE, Athens, Greece. If I were to ask you, what do you call it when, let's say, again, using the United States as an example, what do you call it when, all jokes aside, when the Senate and the House of Representatives get together. What is that called? Congress. Okay. Well, in the 8th century BCE, the ancient Greeks in Athens didn't call it Congress. They called it Ecclesia. Ecclesia in Greek, Ecclesia in Latin. Of all the terms, so it means a political assembly. Okay, that's what the term means. Ecclesia, political assembly. Of all the terms that the New Testament authors could have chosen to refer to their community of like-minded believers in this Jesus Christ, of all words they could have chosen to call it, they didn't call it a community. They didn't call themselves Christians. Again, it was the Romans that actually gave the Christians the name Christians later on. They called it an ecclesia, a political assembly, a term loaded with meaning then, obviously, in the 1st century in the ancient Roman Empire. How is this term usually translated into English? Church. What do you think of, or what did you used to think of now that you know what the term really means, when you heard this term in English, church? Not bells and whistles and pews and altars and statues of saints and incense and whatever. Political assembly. If you add another Greek adjective to that, ecclesia catholica, or in Latin, catholica, right? Catholic. It means worldwide, universal, worldwide political assembly. That's what Catholic Church really means. And consequently, what Paul is laying out here for us in these 6 appearances is the very first structure of that political assembly, albeit of Christ, but nevertheless, that's what the term really means. And he's giving us now the very first ecclesiology within Christianity, these 6 points. And they're actually parallel. That is, if you take the first 3 points, the first 3 appearances, and put them on the left side, you can match them up with the second set of 3 appearances on the right side. So these 6 appearances, Cephas, it's pronounced Cephas, the 12, 500 brethren, James, the apostles, and me. What is the first thing that a president does upon being elected? Again, let's just use the United States of America as an example. What's the very first thing they do before the inauguration, before they speechify, before anything? Once they're elected, they have to create a cabinet. And therefore, anytime you see 12 by itself, or if it's the 12 apostles, that is referring to the cabinet. In this case, the cabinet not of the president, but the same role that the president has, namely that first appearance, Cephas. God forbid if you've ever known anyone who has suffered from encephalitis, it means they have some disease of the brain. Kephas is a Greek word meaning head. So that would make sense then. If Jesus is raised from the dead, who's the first one he's going to appear to? The head of this political assembly. Makes sense. But you may ask, well, wait a minute. I thought Jesus Christ is the head. He is. So how does this work? Is he looking in a mirror at himself? No. Who or what is the Cephas then? We'll come to that when we look at the Gospel of Matthew, the last passage we're going to look at. Okay, so appears to the head, the 12, the head's cabinet, and we said kind of the analogy of President of the United States. That sounds like a national level, right? Maybe a universal level. How do you somehow capture that? Maybe symbolically using a number? 500. That sounds good. Gets better. Remember the ancient Athenian democracies, Ecclesia, in the 8th century BCE? You know how many members of their assembly they had? Take a wild guess. 500. Paul knows exactly what he's doing here. Okay, so this then is the structure of this worldwide political assembly at a universal level. Just as in the case of a presidential election, let's boil it down to very local, grassroots level, even level below the state, county, let's say a municipality, a town, right? What's the first thing that a mayor does when elected? Forms a cabinet. And so consequently, the fifth appearance, whenever you see apostles by itself in the New Testament, that's code for the cabinet of the head, the kephas, at the local level. Who's this James guy? That fourth appearance? He is the, not mayor, but what the Christians will call the episkopos, overseer, manager, supervisor, bishop. At the local level of this worldwide political assembly of Christ, but at the local level where? In Jerusalem. James, who's also one of the 12, the cabinet of the universal level, is also the bishop, the kephas, the head at the local level, specifically Jerusalem. Finally, last appearance, not just to Paul, but to me. You can't get much more local than one. Okay. With that said, that then, as I mentioned, is the first ever ecclesiology structure of this worldwide political assembly of Christ, the Catholic Church. And it occurs within the very first passage ever written, in the first book ever written of the New Testament. So that's not a coincidence either. Again, Paul knows very well what he's doing, the importance of what he's doing as he lays out his argument. The last thing I want to point out, because we're going to come back to this now in the next two passages that we look at, is the word highlighted in red, both in the English translation as well as the Greek translation. In the English translation, in this case, the translation uses the word Christ. That is, that Christ died for our sins, the kerygma, etc. Okay, and you see that word highlighted in Greek. In this case, that is an accurate translation. The word in Greek, Christos, Christ. The word means the anointed one, the chosen one, the anointed one, the chosen one, the Christ. You'll see why this is important when we look at the passage from the Gospel of Matthew. With that, all right, if this is then the first book of the New Testament ever to be written, the first part of that first book of the New Testament to ever be written, these first 8 verses of chapter 15 of that book, and think about how much there's packed into that we just unpacked. And there's actually even more, but I think you will agree this is quite enough. Right? We're now going to turn to take a look at the last book of the New Testament to be written, namely the Gospel of John.